Have you ever stopped to think how someone can withstand years of humiliation, deep marks on the body and soul, until one day, just can't stand it anymore? I have something to tell that few historians dared to register, a story that was buried in the colonial Virginia tobacco fields. The case I will share with you now made me tremble when I discovered the original document stored in dusty files. We are not talking about any revolt. We are talking about Isaac, a man who has transformed the very tool of his torture into an instrument of revenge calculated for years. Before continuing, if you value real stories that have been deliberately erased from the official books, tap the inscription button, because I bring to light cases that challenge everything that taught us about our own story. What you will find out about this man in the next few minutes will forever change your vision about resistance and how despair can transform any of us. Stay until the end, because there are details of this story that still cause goosebumps, even after almost 3 centuries. The wind still whispers between the ruins of the Blackwood plantation. Pieces of red-worn red bricks, rotten fragments of rotten wood that sustained the imposing big house. The smell of wet earth mixes with the ghostly tobacco aroma that no longer grows there. In this terrain, where now only crows make their dwellings, one of the most meticulous revenge already witnessed in colonial America has been unfolded. Isaac's story is not just about a man who said enough, but about how systematic cruelty eventually produces unforeseen consequences. Among these fallen walls, 8 men lost their lives in a single night, not by accident, not for illness, but by the calloused hands of those who knew every inch of that property. When the powerful abuse boundlessness of the power they have on other humans, nature responds with a force that accumulates silently until, like water dammed for too long, breaks all barriers with uncontrollable violence. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Blackwood Plantation stretched over 1,000 acres in Goochland County, Virginia. In the center, there was a big house, a majestic 2-story building with white columns and tall windows, from where John Blackwood commanded his small empire with iron hands. Around, there were 10 barns for tobacco processing, 2 warehouses of equipment, a house of overseers, and in the farther areas, hidden between shrubs and trees, the 48 cabins where the enslaved were slept. The sun was born at 4 in the morning, and with it, the bell it called for work. From dawn to long after sunset, men, women, and children bowed over the red earth, planting, harvesting, and processing the tobacco leaves that enriched their lord. The whip strained regularly, tearing skin and muscle, maintaining the pace of production. The green tobacco stench impregnated everything: clothes, hair, skin, while the muffled warmth of Virginian summer made sweat drain through exhausted faces. In the evening, the creak of the doors of the cabins being locked on the outside echoed by darkness, announcing another full journey on the Blackwood grinding machine. In the shadows, it was whispered that something was about to happen, that the harvest of that year of 1748 would be different from all the previous ones. Isaac was not like the others. At 32, he carried in his body the marks of a lifetime under the yoke of Blackwood, but his eyes retained a keen intelligence that few noticed. Born in the plantation, he had learned to read, hidden by observing the classes of the sons of the Lord through the window of the big house. His rope skill was legendary. No one made more perfect bonds, safer ties, or more resistant nodes. "Isaac has blessed hands for the ropes," said old Martin, the foreman of the plantation, without imagining how this ability would be used against him. By its competence, Isaac was traveling through all the spaces of the farm, from the most distant fields to the stable near the big house. It was he who tied tobacco loads in the wagons, who fixed the horses' arrayos, who braided the ropes that supported the barrels of water. "The rope man," he called him, and he accepted the nickname with a contained smile, keeping to himself the thoughts that boiled behind that apparent acceptance. At night, when everyone slept, their agile fingers trained specific nodes, accurate sequences, improved techniques over the years. The community trusted him. It was Isaac who whispered words of comfort to newcomers, who taught brevity to the younger ones, who preserved the stories of ancestors on new moon nights. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth. If you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The cruelty in Blackwood knew no limits. First, It was the Chicotados public by insolence. 50 blows that left their backs in alive for weeks. Then came the most elaborate punishments. The man who dared to ask for more food and was forced to stay 3 days tied to a tree without water. The young woman who rejected the sexual advances of the Son of the Lord and had her baby sold to a distant plantation. The elderly who could not fulfill his daily quota and was left naked in a cage under the scorching sun until it fade. Isaac watched everything, his face an impassive mask that hid the growing fury on his chest. Each new atrocity added a layer to its meticulous plane. Each scream of pain was recorded in its memory as fuel for what was to come. When Thomas, a young man of only 16, was flogged to death for falling asleep during work, Isaac realized a change in himself. The fear that previously paralyzed became a cold and calculating determination. At night, in his cabin, he watched his own calloused hands and thought, "These serving hands can also destroy." The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon of May. Sarah, Isaac's wife, was 7 months pregnant when she was accused of stealing a loaf of bread from the big house's kitchen. Without judgment or a chance of defense, he was dragged to the center of the yard where all enslaved were forced to watch. "Let it serve as an example," shouted John Blackwood, while the whip down Sarah's back 20 times. Isaac was contained by 4 men while desperately tried to reach her. Her shouts pierced the moist air of the afternoon, mixing with the sound of the rain. When it all over, Sarah was thrown into the cabin like a torn flour bag. For 3 days, Isaac took care of her, cleaning the wounds with warm water, applying herb paterlasms that the elders had taught. On the 4th day, she went into premature labor. The child was born dead, and Sarah, weakened by the loss of blood and the infection that had settled in the wounds, followed her before dawn. Isaac washed his wife's body with rainwater collected in a gourd, wrapped it in a white cloth that kept for special occasions, and buried it under a tree at the boundaries of the plantation. It didn't even spill a tear. Instead, he cut a strand of her hair and tied it with a perfect knot around her wrist. "I promise," whispered to the newly feed tomb, the words carried by the night wind. John Blackwood was not the only demon in Blackwood. There was Martin, the chief foreman, known for his metal tip whip that pulled out pieces of meat with each blow. William, Blackwood's eldest son, who hunted fugitive slaves with the same excitement with which he hunted deer. Thomas Rigby, the slave trader who visited the plantation regularly, separating families with the coldness of those who separate corn grains. The brothers Fletcher, responsible for the night discipline, who had fun waking up the enslaved in the middle of the night for random inspections that often ended in beating. Joseph Merrick, the plantation doctor, who used black bodies for his scientific experiments. Edward Collins, the accountant, who deliberately manipulated the records so that no slavery could ever buy his freedom. And finally, the Reverend Samuel Hayes, who preached submission as divine virtue as he blessed the whip. The final catalyst came when, after Sarah's death, Isaac was summoned to the big house. Blackwood, sitting in his leather armchair with a glass of whiskey in his hand, looked at him with disdain. "I heard that you lost your wife. A pity. But now that you are alone, it can be more useful in the stables. From tomorrow, you will sleep there." Isaac kept his eyes low as expected, while inside him something definitely broke. That night, when he returned to his hut for the last time, he made his final decision. There would be no return. Public humiliation came 2 weeks after Sarah's death. It was Sunday, the day that the enslaved received their weekly feed. Isaac, who had not eaten properly since his wife's funeral, was in line when William Blackwood appeared, visibly drunk. "You there, the string maker. Come here." Isaac approached, low eyes, tense body. "Show me how it does your miraculous nodes," William ordered, throwing a piece of rope to the floor. Calmly, Isaac took the rope and began to demonstrate a complex knot. "No, not so. I want to see the knot I would use to hang a man," laughed William. A heavy silence fell on the crowd. Isaac felt the blood pulsate in your temples. "I don't know this kind of knot, sir," he replied with a controlled voice. "Liar!" shouted William, slap that made Isaac staggers. "Everyone knows that you know all the possible nodes. Make a gallows knot now, or I will assume that you are planning to use it in us." Slowly, with non-shaking fingers, Isaac made a perfect run, up knot. William tore him out of his hands, laughing, and then, in a quick gesture, passed him through Isaac's neck and pulled, not enough to kill, but enough to cut his breath for a few seconds. "Look, he looks good at you." He laughed as Isaac fell to his knees, fighting for air. The crowd watched in horrified silence. When William finally got tired of the joke and walked away, Isaac remained kneeling, the red mark of the rope around his neck, a crystal-clear decision forming in his mind like ice in stopped water. That night marked the beginning of the preparations. Isaac knew he could not accomplish his plan alone. With extreme care, he selected 5 trusted people: Elijah, a 50-year-old man who had lost his whole family in an auction; Naomi, a middle-aged woman who worked in the Casa Big Kitchen and had access to valuable information; Samuel, a strong young man who took care of the stables; Ruth, an elder of herbs and potions; and Jacob, an agile boy who knew every inch of the property. For weeks, they found each other in different places each time, always with the excuse of prayers for the dead. Isaac designated precise functions for each one. Naomi would be his eyes and ears in the big house, informing about the Blackwood movements. Samuel would guarantee access to stables and tools. Ruth would prepare a special mixture of herbs that, when burned, would produce a smoke that can make people sleepy. Jacob maps the best escape routes, and Elijah, with his age that inspired less suspicion, would be the messenger among all. Isaac meticulously calculated every detail, from the exact location where each target would be to the time required for each phase of the operation. String were stolen gradually, one at a time, and hidden in different places. The date chosen was not by chance, September 15th, the harvest party, when you would be distracted by the celebrations and the loose-running whiskey. "The time of the final harvest," Isaac whispered to his accomplices when they finished the preparations. One day before the scheduled date, everyone took the same oath: "For the memory of those we lose, for the freedom of those who will come." On the eve of the harvest party, the Blackwood plantation boiled with activity. In the big house, employees ran from side to side, preparing the great banquet that would receive farmers from all over the region. Crystals were polished, silver were sneeped, the best whiskey was placed in glass decanters. John Blackwood personally supervised the disposition of the tables in the Great Hall, while William checked the wine stocks imported from France. The brothers Fletcher organized a small violin and flute presentation to entertain the guests, and Reverend Hayes rehearsed his speech of thanks for the generous harvest that God had provided. Meanwhile, at the back of the property, Isaac and his accomplices moved as shadows. Samuel prepared the stables, making sure there would be sealed horses ready for the escape. Ruth mixed her herbs in a small cauldron, the strong smell disguised by the aroma of the food that would be served at the party. Jacob last checked the escape routes, mentally marking each tree, every stone, every stream that would have to cross. Naomi in the kitchen listened closely to the conversations of the gentlemen, memorizing schedules and places where each would be at night, and Elijah, sitting in a remote corner, silently sharpened 8 small knives. When the sun began to put it, dyeing the sky with a blood red, Isaac gave the combined signal 3 beats on the side of the main barn. The time had arrived. The execution started precisely at 9 o'clock at night, when the party was at the height. Isaac, wearing clean clothes he had reserved for that special occasion, went to the stable, where he met his accomplices. "There is no return," he said, looking into their eyes. "If anyone wants to give up, this is the moment." No one moved. With a silent nod, they separated into their designated positions. The first phase was isolation. Naomi, serving punch to the party, discreetly added Ruth's mixture to the drink specifically intended for the chosen targets. The effect was not lethal. It would only induce drowsiness and confusion. Meanwhile, Jacob and Samuel were strategically positioned themselves for the property, ready to intercept anyone who interfered with the plan. The second phase began when, one by one, the targets began to take the effects of the potion and to withdraw to different parts of the property. Martin, the foreman, was the first, staggering to the barn to take an air. Isaac was waiting for him in the shadows. "Good night, Martin," he said softly, emerging from darkness. The foreman, confused by drink and herbs, barely had time to record surprise before the perfect bond involved his neck. William Blackwood was next, attracted to the stable by a fake message about a sick horse. "You should never have touched on that rope," Isaac whispered in his ear as the knot closed. One by one the others followed. Thomas Rigby, found on the way to the latrine. The Fletcher brothers, intercepted when they went to check a suspicious noise. Joseph Merrick, the doctor, attracted by a false emergency call. Edward Collins, the accountant, captured when he fetched more whiskey in the basement. And finally, the Reverend Hayes, who went out to commune with God under the stars. For each one, Isaac had specific words, reminding them exactly the crimes they had committed. 8 perfect knots, 8 bodies swing in darkness, each hanging in a place that symbolized their particular cruelties. John Blackwood, the lord of the plantation, was purposely spared. Isaac wanted him to live to find his trusted men in the morning, wanted him to feel what it was to lose everything in one night. When the last body was hung, the Reverend Hayes properly on the great wooden cross in the center of the torero, Isaac met with his accomplices at the combined point. The silence between them was carried not of repentance, but of a strange peace. "It's done," he said simply. Ruth lit a small bonfire with dried twigs, and around her, the 6 Libertadores organized her departure. Naomi had stolen enough bread and dried meat for 3 days of travel. Jacob had mental maps that would lead them to a free black community in the Pennsylvania mountains. Samuel had brought 6 stable horses, the strongest and most resistant. "Not everyone will make it," Isaac said, looking at the flames. "But some of us must live to tell this story." In a makeshift ritual, each threw a personal object at the fire, a piece of fabric, a small straw doll, a bone-made amulet. Isaac was the last, throwing the strand of Sarah's hair in the flames that he had looked tied to the wrist. "It's free now," he murmured. Around the plantation, other enslaved began to realize that something had happened. Cabana's doors were open silently, apprehensive faces peeked into the darkness. Isaac had not planned a mass revolt. He knew it would be suicide. But he had left clear instructions with Elijah, who would be behind his own choice, being too old for escape. When the alarm sounded, those who wanted would have the chance to escape the followed chaos. At dawn, a column of smoke rose from the Blackwood plantation, and 42 slaves had disappeared at night, following in different directions. The last image Isaac saw, looking behind the top of a distant hill, was the rising sun illuminating 8 silhouettes that swing in the morning breeze. The news of the Blackwood massacre spread like fire in dry straw. Horse messengers brought information to neighboring plantations. Alarmed letters were sent to Richmond and Williamsburg. Official reports described the event as the most terrible act of savagery ever witnessed in the Virginia colony. The governor issued a proclamation offering £200 for the capture of Isaac, the black who knows the ropes, alive or dead. But the deepest effect was felt in other plantations, where gentlemen they started sleeping with weapons under the pillows and suspecting any slaves showing rope skills. In the following weeks, similar events, although on a smaller scale, were reported at plantations from Maryland, North Carolina, and even distant Georgia. A worker found hanged from her own whip, a slave trader hanging from the tree where she used to make auctions, a pastor who preached submission balancing her own pulpit. The Isaac method, as it became known in the nightclubs of the Senzalas, spread like a legend, an unlisted manual of resistance. For the enslaved it was a whisper of hope. For you, a recurring nightmare. John Blackwood, who had physically surviving that night, was never the same. He refused to leave home after dusk, shouted with shadows, and eventually sold what was left of his property for a fraction of value, returning to England a broken and tormented man. The hunt for Isaac lasted almost 2 years. Militias were specifically formed to find it. Sniffer dogs were brought from the Ropa. Rewards were increased repeatedly. The 5 who fled with him were captured one by one. Naomi, after 3 months, was found working as a cook under a false name in a Baltimore pension. Samuel resisted bravely when surrounded by a militia in Pennsylvania, killing 2 men before being shot down. Ruth died of fever even before she was captured, and Jacob was betrayed by a free black man who recognized his description in a wanted poster. Only Isaac remained free, moving like a ghost among clandestine communities, sometimes briefly reappearing to perform another symbolic hanging before disappearing again. It was in March 1750 that the siege was finally closed. Stunned in an abandoned cabin on the Blue Ridge Mountains, Isaac was surrounded by 26 armed men. The battle lasted hours. He had prepared the cabin with traps, and, even alone, managed to kill 7 of the stalkers before the ceiling was set on fire. When they finally captured him, semi-conscious and with serious burns, his first words when awakening were, "Don't hang me. Don't give yourself that pleasure." His trial in Richmond was the fastest in colonial history, less than 30 minutes between prosecution and sentence. When the judge asked him if he had last words before being condemned, Isaac rose, chains in his wrists and ankles, and in a clear voice that echoed through the crowded court, "I showed you that we know how to do us as well as you." The execution was scheduled for a week after the trial, enough time for people from all over the colony to travel to watch the show. On the designated day, more than 3,000 people gathered in the central square of Richmond. Isaac was brought in a wagon, his body still marked by the burns and tortures suffered after the capture. Contrary to the custom, it would not be hanged. The authorities feared transforming it into martyr through the very method that had become famous. Instead, it would be burned alive, tied to a pole. While the chains were replaced by thick ropes, Isaac looked at the clear sky of that spring morning and smiled. The executor, noticing the smile, asked with disdain, "What are you laughing, Black?" Isaac looked at him in the eye and replied, "These we are badly made." It was his last officially registered words. When the flames began to rise, witnesses reported that Isaac did not shout at once, keeping their eyes fixed in something distant, beyond the bloodthirsty. What no one knew at the time, which would only be discovered decades later in a confessional letter of one of the guards, was that, the night before the execution, Isaac had somehow mysteriously managed to hang herself in her own cell, wearing strips of her clothes. The body that burned in the square was already lifeless, his soul having broken in his own terms, with a last perfect knot. Isaac's story did not end with his death. In the following decades, his figure became a legend among the enslaved communities of the Southern. In the moonless nights, stories were told about the man of the strings, who watched the oppressors of the shadows, ready to do justice. Smallus began to appear, hidden under cabin flooring, hanging discreetly in trees near plantations where overseers were particularly cruel. Coded songs spoke of tying evil and we release, conveying the resistance message from generation to generation. Secret pilgrims visited the unmarked place where Isaac's ashes were believed to have been thrown, leaving small pieces of rope as offerings. In academic circles, the Blackwood case would eventually be studied as one of the first documented examples of organized resistance in colonial America, although often sanitized and minimized. But in popular memory, in the stories whispered at the ear, Isaac remained as it, not an abstract symbol, but a royal man who turned the tool of his oppression into an instrument of liberation. In Virginia's plantations, years later, gentlemen still shuddered when he heard the sound of ropes being braided in the darkness. And somewhere, perhaps, Sarah's spirit was smiling to see that her death had not been in vain. If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Isaac's story touched your heart. Share so that Isaac's memory will never be forgotten. The Blackwood plantation, which once prospered with the sweat and blood of hundreds of enslaved souls, never recovered after that fateful night. The tobacco fields, before green and lush, were gradually swallowed by wild vegetation. The big house, abandoned by John Blackwood in his escape to England, was plundered during the American Revolution and then consumed by a mysterious fire in 1781. Today, only foundation fragments and some stones mark where so many atrocities were committed and where, for one night, the justice balance drew the other side. Isaac's legacy transcended time and space. During the Civil War, more than 100 years later, Union soldiers reported having found fugitive slaves using a code system based on different types of nodes to convey messages. Academics debate whether there is a direct connection with the Isaac method, but in the African American communities of Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland, There is no doubt knowledge has been passed through generations, a silent will to man who turned a liberation weapon skill.